My name is Anna Cooper, and the night everything snapped began with a call I should have let ring. I had barely stepped into my Kansas City apartment when my phone lit up with my mother's name. Her tone was cold enough to tell me she wasn't calling to check on me. She didn't warm up the conversation or pretend to care. She just said it. I know you paid off the $860,000 mortgage, but we've decided to gift the house to your brother as his wedding present. The sentence hit like a door slamming shut, but she didn't stop there. And you're not invited to the wedding. I don't want your presence ruining his day. For a moment the room felt too still, like even the air didn't know how to move after hearing something that cruel. 5 years of sacrifice, of choosing their stability over my own life, dismissed as if it were nothing. My uncle, who happened to be visiting, looked up the second my expression changed. He didn't know the exact words, but he understood the weight behind them. I lowered the phone slowly, not because I was shocked, but because something inside me finally clicked into place. I looked at him and said, "Do you want to tell them, or should I?" It wasn't a threat. It was the first honest reaction I'd had toward my family in years. Sometimes it only takes one sentence from the people you love to show you exactly where you were never welcome. If you've ever felt the moment your value disappeared in someone else's eyes, stay with me. What came after that call changed everything they thought they could take from me. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. Growing up in the Cooper household in the outskirts of Kansas City meant learning very early that fairness depended entirely on who you were, and I was never the child those rules were made for. Margaret Cooper. My mother wasn't outwardly cruel, but she carried a certainty about Jason that made him the unquestioned center of every room. It was in the way she placed a hand on his shoulder when he entered, the way her tone lifted when she said his name, the way she noticed his smallest discomforts, while mine passed without acknowledgement. My father, David Cooper, didn't reinforce the favoritism out loud. He simply chose silence, which in our home worked exactly the same as agreement. His attempts at peace were really just a refusal to disrupt whatever narrative my mother preferred, and because her narrative always placed Jason first, Jason remained first by default. Our house wasn't large, but the distribution of everything inside it made the difference feel enormous. Jason got the bigger bedroom because he needed the space. He got the new shoes because boys go through things faster. He got the upgraded bike, the better coat, the allowance raised without explanation. I was the child who didn't need much, at least. That's what they told themselves whenever something was denied to me. At school, the contrast grew sharper. Jason never wondered how he would pay for field trips or supplies. Those things simply appeared in his backpack because my mother made sure of it. When I needed the same items, I learned to calculate whether a weekend of babysitting or running errands in the neighborhood would cover it. I developed a habit of quietly replacing things as they wore out because asking for help usually meant being told to make do or be responsible, words my mother used like praise, even when they didn't feel like it. By the time I was 12, the pattern had solidified into something unspoken but rigid. Jason's chores could be forgotten without consequence. Mine were checked as if they were obligations I had volunteered for. If we both argued our case, Jason's frustration was justified, while mine was labeled disrespectful. I wasn't encouraged to raise my voice, solve a problem, or even expect fairness. Instead, I learned to adapt, filling the gaps my parents left for me, and stepping aside when they created space for Jason. Even small moments revealed how wide the divide was. Relatives visiting for holidays would ruffle Jason's hair, congratulate him on accomplishments he barely remembered doing, and hand him envelopes for later. When they turned to me, they used words like mature, helpful, strong-willed, all compliments that sounded nice, until you realized they usually meant a child who had figured out how to get by without depending on anyone. Our neighbors noticed the difference too. They never said it directly, but I could see it in the way they looked at my mother hovering near Jason at community events, while I lingered on the edges, invisible, but expected to be perfectly composed. Independence became second nature, not because I chose it, but because it was the only position available to me. Thinking about it now, there wasn't one big defining moment that taught me my place. It was the steady build of countless smaller ones. Every ignored request, every diverted conversation, every time Jason was lifted forward, while I was told to manage on my own, each one shaped a truth I absorbed long before I had the words for it. I didn't resent them the way people assume. Resentment requires expectation, and I learned early not to expect anything. What I understood even as a child was that some families don't operate on love expressed equally. They operate on roles assigned long before you have a chance to question them. And in mine, I was never cast as the one to be protected or celebrated. I was the one expected to endure. A quiet afternoon was supposed to be nothing more than a short visit, but the moment I stepped through the front door, something in the air felt off the way. A room holds its breath when everyone inside is pretending things are fine. I headed to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, and while looking for a clean cup, I pulled open a drawer I didn't remember being used for anything except spare napkins. Instead, I found a stack of unopened envelopes, thick enough to press the bottom of the drawer downward. Every envelope carried the same Missouri Bank logo, the same printed warnings, and the same untouched seal, and the weight of them in my hands told me everything my parents had avoided saying for months. When I walked into the dining room with the envelopes, Margaret Cooper froze as if I had caught her doing something she already regretted. David Cooper looked at me then at the stack, then back at the floor like he had expected this moment, but hoped it wouldn't come today. Neither of them spoke until I asked, "How long has this been sitting here without anyone opening it?" Margaret started talking first, not with an explanation but with excuses layered over panic. Something about a slow season, about unpredictable bills, about temporary setbacks, yet every word felt like a shield instead of the truth. David didn't defend himself. He simply avoided my eyes, which said more than any apology he could have rehearsed. Before the tension snapped, Frank Miller stepped in from the hallway. He looked at the envelopes, asked for them calmly, and began sorting through dates and notices, while the rest of us watched. Frank understood financial trouble better than most people in our family, and the deeper he read into the letters, the tighter his expression grew. When he finally looked up, he didn't sugarcoat anything. The mortgage was not just late, it was deep into delinquency, far enough that the bank had already initiated the first steps toward taking back the property. They were weeks away from a forced sale if nothing changed. Margaret tried to frame it as a rough patch, insisting they always planned to catch up, but Frank cut through the excuses, explaining that the situation wasn't one missed payment, but a chain of ignored warnings. Jason, who had been sitting on the stairs scrolling through his phone with zero interest in any of this, only looked up long enough to ask, "So is someone fixing it, or what?" As if losing the house would be an inconvenience for him, not a life-altering disaster for everyone else. I wasn't angry yet, just stunned that something this serious had been hidden from me when I lived only 30 minutes away. Frank handed me the newest letter, the one with the final notice stamped across the top, and reading the amount still owed felt like having the floor shift under me. It was a number big enough to choke any normal household, but not impossible if someone was willing to sacrifice their entire future to carry it. For a long moment, no one said anything. I looked at my parents, waited for one of them to offer a plan, a solution, anything resembling responsibility. But Margaret looked at me with the expression of someone hoping I'd step in. David looked like he already expected it. Jason had returned to his phone. And that was the moment the truth settled in. If someone was going to save the house, it was going to be me, the daughter they expected to be fine on her own. My voice stayed steady when I finally said, "I'll take over the payments." Margaret exhaled in relief. David nodded as if this outcome had always been obvious, and Jason didn't bother reacting at all. But Frank watched me differently, with concern rather than gratitude. He told me that if I was going to shoulder something this massive, I needed protection, legal protection, written and enforceable. He drafted a trust under Missouri law that tied the property to my contributions, not to promises or family narratives, a document that stated clearly that as long as I made the payments, the house could never be transferred without my consent. I signed it because someone had to take control before everything collapsed, but I didn't know then that the same sacrifice I made to keep my family from losing everything would eventually become the thing they tried hardest to take from me. The years that followed didn't feel dramatic or heroic. They felt repetitive, predictable, the kind of routine you fall into when you stop expecting anything in return. Every month brought another mortgage payment, another reminder of the responsibility I had agreed to carry, and I handled it the same way I handled every challenge in my life, quietly and without asking anyone for recognition. I adjusted my life around the obligation. I picked up extra shifts when I could, passed on trips. Friends invited me to bought groceries with more calculation than comfort, and treated every dollar like it needed a purpose. My world shrank in ways my family never bothered to notice, but I adapted because someone had to. What became strange wasn't the sacrifice, it was how naturally my family rewrote the story around it. Whenever relatives asked how things were going with the house, Margaret would speak about staying disciplined or pushing through tough years as if she were the one wiring the payments. David chimed in with nods that suggested shared effort, though he hadn't contributed a single cent toward the mortgage since the day Frank Miller laid out the numbers. Neither of them ever mentioned my name. I stayed quiet not because I wanted to protect them, but because arguing with them felt pointless. Correcting their version of reality meant starting a fight they would twist into ingratitude. Meanwhile, Jason moved through life as if financial trouble had never brushed against his world. He didn't ask what the mortgage balance looked like or how much time was left. He didn't seem to realize that every month I signed a payment, I delayed building anything of my own. He treated stability like something guaranteed, a luxury he never acknowledged because he never had to. A few springs later, Margaret organized a small family dinner, insisting it would be nice to get everyone together. I went for the same reason I always went, to keep the peace enough that Frank didn't worry about me carrying too much alone. The evening was comfortable in the way routine family gatherings are, loud conversations layered over one another, the smell of food drifting through the house, cousins comparing jobs and plans. I took a seat near the back content to observe, rather than participate, the same role I had quietly fallen into over the years. Later that night, Jason arrived with several friends trailing behind him. I didn't know them, but their energy was unmistakable, carefree, unburdened, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to deal with real consequences. I didn't pay much attention until they moved toward the hallway behind me, talking loudly enough that their words carried over the rest of the noise in the room. One of the guys asked Jason what he planned to do after graduation and whether he was going to move to his own place. Jason laughed, not in embarrassment but in certainty, and said, "Why would I move anywhere? That house is basically mine already. They'll hand it over eventually." He said it like it was a fact, like nothing about the last several years could possibly contradict that expectation. He didn't say my name, didn't acknowledge my effort, didn't hesitate before claiming a future built entirely on something he never lifted a finger for. The words didn't make me angry immediately. They made everything inside me go still, the way a room falls silent before a storm. I stood there listening to him claim ownership over something he had never sacrificed a single night's sleep for, and I felt an old truth settle deeper than before. My family didn't overlook my effort, they dismissed it. Not out of ignorance, but out of entitlement. Jason had grown up believing the world would mold itself around him, and our parents had reinforced that belief so consistently that he couldn't imagine any other version of reality, even one where legal documents tied the house to me, not him. As the conversations around me continued, laughter mixing with clinking glasses, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't reached until that night. My sacrifices didn't register in their world. The years I had spent paying for the roof over their heads weren't part of the story they told about our family. To them, the house wasn't a responsibility I carried, it was a prize waiting for Jason. And for the first time, I wasn't just hurt by that. I was done pretending it didn't matter. Things took a sharper turn the moment Jason announced he was getting married to a woman named Emily Carter. He shared the news during a casual dinner, saying it with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that life would unfold neatly in front of him. Margaret nearly burst with excitement, already envisioning the photos, the decorations, the guests. David acted like he had been waiting years for this announcement. I congratulated them, because it was the polite thing to do, even as something inside me braced for the conversations I knew were coming. It didn't take long. Within minutes, Margaret shifted the topic toward the house on Maple Ridge. She spoke about it the way people speak about something they already considered decided, saying it would be a perfect place for a young couple starting out, and that she was glad they held on to it all these years for Jason's future. David added comments about stability and tradition, phrases that sounded harmless, unless you were the person who had paid for that stability sentence by sentence through the trust documents Frank Miller helped prepare. They talked around me, not to me, as if their version of the story had fully replaced the truth. I stayed quiet and watched their excitement build on a foundation I had laid without any of them noticing. When I met Emily for the first time a few weeks later, I expected someone who mirrored Jason's entitlement. Instead, she greeted me with genuine warmth, calling me Anna, with a kind of gentle sincerity that caught me off guard. She seemed nervous in a sweet, well-meaning way, eager to make a good impression on her future family. She had no idea she was walking straight into a history shaped almost entirely by imbalance. At a small gathering my parents hosted for her side of the family, Emily and I ended up preparing drinks together in the kitchen. She glanced toward the window where the house on Maple Ridge was visible down the street and smiled in a way that told me she saw it as a symbol of hope, not obligation. Jason says his parents have been saving that house for him since he was young, she said lightly. I'm lucky we'll get to start married life in a place that's already ours. She wasn't smug. She was grateful, unaware that she had just repeated a story that erased years of sacrifice I had carried alone. For a moment, I considered telling her the truth, but I saw the innocence in her expression and realized she wasn't the one who had built the lie. So I just nodded, letting the silence answer for me. Something tightened inside my chest, not anger, but a deepening recognition that my family didn't simply forget my effort, they preferred the version of events where Jason was always destined to receive everything. The mortgage was close to being finished by then. I could count the remaining payments on one hand. Each time I sent money, I wondered if this would be the moment someone acknowledged what I had done, even with a single sentence. A quiet admission. A simple thank you. Something that proved my existence in the story they kept retelling. But every time I stepped into that house, the conversations only reinforced the same narrative: Jason's future. Jason's home. Jason's perfect starting point. There was no space for my name in any of it. The call from Margaret arrived 3 days after that gathering. Her voice carried the same cold certainty she used whenever she delivered a decision disguised as a discussion. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask about work. She didn't even ask if I had time to talk. She went straight to it. And as she spoke, something shifted inside me, not a breaking, but an awakening. It was the moment I understood that the distance I had always felt wasn't imagined, it was designed. And if anything was going to change, it wouldn't start with them. It would have to start with me. I was done waiting for any acknowledgement from them, and the realization settled quietly but firmly as I opened the box Frank Miller once told me to guard. Inside were years of documents, payment receipts, mortgage statements, notarized letters, and the trust agreement bearing my name. Laying everything out on my dining table felt like unfolding the proof of a life I had built alone, while everyone else benefited. Nothing about it made me angry. It simply clarified that silence had never protected me, it had only empowered them. Margaret must have sensed the shift immediately, because she began calling with those carefully measured questions about whether I planned to cause trouble around Jason's wedding. Her voice carried the same tone she used whenever she wanted to disguise control as concern, and hearing it only confirmed how much she feared losing the narrative she had shaped for years. She wasn't worried about family harmony, she was worried about being exposed. Jason, on the other hand, did not bother with subtlety. He waited for me outside my workplace like he was addressing someone who owed him an explanation. He told me the house had always been meant for him and that Emily deserved a peaceful wedding without any dramatic interference. His words weren't surprising, but the entitlement behind them made something finally lock into place. He had no interest in the truth. He had no intention of thanking me. And he had never seen the house as anything but a gift he was entitled to. That certainty pushed me toward a decision I should have made long ago. I gathered every document and drove straight to meet a property attorney named Scott Turner. His office was quiet, structured, and far removed from the emotional chaos I had been dealing with. When he introduced himself, the calm confidence in his voice shifted the entire tone of my resolve. I handed him each document and explained everything: the years of payments I had made, the trust Frank created, the recent announcement that the house would go to Jason, and the expectation that I should simply accept their decision. Scott examined the paperwork with deliberate focus, not needing dramatic reactions or sympathy to show that he understood the situation. When he finally spoke, his clarity cut through everything I had been doubting. The trust was legally sound. My payments gave me documented, provable interest in the property. And any attempt by my parents to transfer the house to Jason without my consent would violate Missouri property law. He laid it out plainly: my rights were not emotional leverage, they were legal fact. Scott recommended filing a property dispute that would immediately freeze any attempt at transfer. He explained that once entered into Missouri's legal system, the hold would block every action related to the house title changes, refinancing attempts, deed transfers, and any wedding-related ownership claims. Nothing could move forward unless I approved it or a judge overturned it. And based on the strength of my documentation, he said that outcome was extremely unlikely. Together, we organized the timeline, labeled each receipt, attached the trust evidence, and built a complete legal barrier around my contribution. When Scott submitted the filing and handed me the stamped confirmation, it felt like the first time in my life that the truth wasn't something they could talk over. It was official. It was enforceable. And it was beyond their reach. They could ignore me in their conversations, but the state of Missouri would not. For the first time, the house was not a symbol of imbalance. It was a boundary they could not cross, and I no longer needed their permission to protect what I had built. 2 days before the wedding, a city vehicle rolled to a stop in front of the Cooper house, and the sight alone was enough to slice through the calm they were pretending to maintain. The man who stepped out, identified as Daniel Harris from the Jackson County Property Office, carried an official envelope and asked for Margaret Cooper by name. She answered the door with a smile meant for neighbors, not government officials, but it faltered when he handed her the notice confirming that the Cooper residence was legally frozen due to an active ownership dispute. Jason appeared behind her, grabbed the papers, skimmed the first lines, and quickly tried to shove the envelope behind a stack of boxes in the hallway, as if hiding it would keep the problem from touching the wedding. The three of them stood there in a tight silence, broken only by the sound of Daniel returning to his car. They didn't say a word about it to anyone that night. The decision was simple: press forward, pretend nothing was wrong, and hope the issue wouldn't surface until after the ceremony. When the wedding day arrived, everything was staged to perfection. The reception hall glowed under warm lights. The floral arrangements matched the exact colors Emily had dreamed of since childhood, and the guests were dressed as if attending a gala. The ceremony concluded flawlessly, leaving everyone relaxed enough to enjoy cocktails and polite conversations. They had no idea a storm was walking straight toward them. As the band shifted into a soft melody, Margaret stepped onto the stage holding a champagne glass and preparing for the moment she believed would seal her status as the generous matriarch. She tapped the microphone and began speaking with the confidence of someone who assumed the world would bend the way she wanted it to. "Thank you all for celebrating Jason and Emily," she said, her voice full of pride. "Today our family is thrilled to present them with an extraordinary gift, the Cooper family home." The final word never made it out. The hall doors opened sharply and Daniel Harris entered once more wearing the same city badge and carrying another envelope. Conversations halted instantly. He walked down the aisle between the tables unbothered by the staring guests and reached the stage. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, maintaining a clear, formal tone, "I am required to deliver this immediately." He handed her the sealed notice, then turned toward the microphone with professional detachment. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. This is an official announcement from the Jackson County Property Office. The property known as the Cooper residence is under active legal dispute, and all transfer activity is suspended until further determination." A heavy silence swallowed the room before splitting into gasps, whispers, and stunned exclamations. Emily stared at Jason, confused and shaken, demanding to know what he had kept from her. Jason stepped forward as if to defend himself, but anger and panic fought for control on his face, leaving him unable to form a coherent explanation. Several relatives exchanged glances that revealed what they had quietly known for years, that I was the one who kept the house afloat, not the couple being presented as its rightful heirs. Margaret clutched the envelope, as if the force of her grip could undo the announcement, and the confidence she had worn moments earlier evaporated under the weight of the public revelation. Emily stepped back from Jason, her expression collapsing as the future she imagined twisted into something she no longer recognized. The wedding's perfect facade shattered in front of everyone, and nothing they tried to hide remained hidden. The wedding album never appeared on social media, and the silence surrounding it carried more truth than any explanation they tried to offer. Within days, the Cooper house, which they once boasted about with pride, became a locked asset they could no longer touch. The legal freeze remained in place, and every attempt they made to inquire about transferring ownership was redirected to the trust documents I controlled. The same house they imagined handing over as a gift now existed outside their reach, shielded by the boundaries they ignored for years. Margaret and David confronted the consequences almost immediately. They had been counting on a refinancing plan tied to the home's equity to manage debts they kept hidden behind polite smiles and carefully curated images of stability. Without access to the property, their financial options collapsed. Bills that had been shuffled from month to month turned into reminders they could no longer escape. The sense of order they projected to the world slipped as they struggled to adjust to a reality where their decisions finally carried weight. Jason and Emily entered married life under a very different roof than the one they expected. Instead of settling into the Cooper house, they moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment close to downtown, the kind of place with thin walls that echoed every argument, and a kitchen too small for both of them to stand in comfortably. Emily tried to stay hopeful, but the instability seeped into their daily routines. She started postponing plans she once talked about with excitement, including the idea of having a child, explaining that their finances needed to be more stable, even though the strain in her voice made the truth clear: the life she imagined was no longer possible. Jason carried frustration like a shadow. He had spent years assuming security was something guaranteed to him, not something he needed to build. When that illusion shattered, he looked for somewhere to direct his anger, but blaming me didn't change their living situation, and blaming the system didn't rewrite the records in the Missouri property database. Each time he tried to navigate the consequence, he ran into the same truth: none of it was reversible. From a distance, I didn't gloat, comment, or reach out. I simply stepped away. The separation wasn't dramatic. It was clean, deliberate, and necessary. I blocked their numbers, muted relatives who tried to mediate, and allowed the space to settle around me like a room finally cleared of noise. Without the weight of their expectations, my life moved in steadier lines. Work became easier to focus on, and moments of quiet carried a relief I didn't realize I had been craving for years. Occasionally, updates reached me through people who didn't know they were the only thread connecting us. I heard about Margaret taking on extra shifts, about David selling collectibles he spent decades hoarding, and about Jason juggling side jobs to close the widening gap between bills and income. The stories weren't triumphant or cruel, they were simply the natural outcomes of choices they made while assuming someone else would absorb the consequences. Emily's hesitation about starting a family became a quiet pause that stretched longer as their financial uncertainty deepened, and the strain showed in small things: missed dinners, canceled plans, and polite excuses that revealed deeper cracks beneath the surface. Through it all, I kept my distance, not out of spite, but out of understanding. Some relationships don't need closure, they need absence. Walking away wasn't punishment, it was protection. And as the months passed, the lesson became clearer. Boundaries are not a sign of harshness, they are a declaration of value. The life I built, the sacrifices I made, and the strength it took to stand alone deserved more than silence and erasure. Choosing myself was the ending they never expected, but it was the one that finally made sense. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.